We have challenged ourselves to visit the 12 featured locations in the 2023 Beautiful England calendar on our motorbikes during the month that they feature in said calendar. So far, we visited St Thomas Becket Church in Kent, Bamford Edge in the Peak District, and Whitby Abbey in, well, Whitby. Our destination for the month of April is Padstow Harbour in Cornwall, a destination that made everyone we told prior to the trip say, "Ooh, that's far." It is indeed the furthest trip of the year so far, but as it happens, it wasn't the distance that proved to be the biggest challenge. We've been trying to avoid motorways as much as possible on these trips, though with Cornwall being where it is, relative to where we are, we were going to have to use them quite a bit this time. We would make our way to the M5 and follow that all the way down to Bridgewater, where we would come off and follow the A39 along the coast to Lynmouth, a stretch of road that ranks as Frey's favourite bit of tarmac in the country, before continuing on to Padstow. We'd booked a travel lodge for the night in Wadebridge, and the following morning we'd visit Tintagel Castle, after our previous attempted visit in 2019 was hampered a bit by the bridge being under construction, causing the site to be closed. The day started with bright sunshine, but weather forecasts had suggested that this likely would not last. The first leg of the trip was rather uneventful, noteworthy only because of all but one motorway having average speed limits through roadworks. After a bit of filtering on the M5, we basked in the sun while we could until we entered Somerset and stopped off in Bridgewater for some lunch. It was here that the weather had started to turn, with the rain picking up and, more worryingly, the wind had started to get noticeable. Over lunch we looked at forecasts and saw that the weather was due to get worse, so we revised our route accordingly. The idea of adding 2 hours onto our journey to follow a high-altitude coastal road full of hairpins and steep hills in the pouring rain and increasing winds didn't sound like the most sensible or pleasant idea, so we instead decided to continue on the M5 to its end near Exeter before joining the A30 and following that to Padstow. It's a shame it came to this, as we knew we would very much enjoy the original route, so here is some footage from our visit in 2019 when the weather was much more suitable. As we trundled on, the rain and wind did indeed get worse. We'd both had our waterproofs on, but neither of us had waterproof gloves, and we learned that the waterproofing on both of our boots has diminished somewhat, leaving us with very swampy feet and cold fingertips. The rain got so bad that it actually became a bit funny, but the visibility and occasional bursts of wind called for a much more cautious ride. We arrived in Padstow and parked up at the Harbour car park, which was surprisingly full considering the weather, but it was during the Easter holidays, so there were still plenty of families trying to make the best of things. Unfortunately, there seems to be no motorcycle parking bays here, and no special rate for them either. We paid for an hour and squelched over to the harbour to get the photo. The high winds made it tricky to line up the shot properly, and we didn't fancy getting too close to the harbour's edge, but I think we got it pretty close. We returned to the bikes and gave our gloves a quick wringing out before heading to the hotel to attempt to dry our clothes for the morning. One thing with travel lodges are the weird hookless hangers, as they can't be hung anywhere else, leaving you limited on being able to air things properly. Still, we eventually got most things dry enough by the morning, ready to head to Tintagel to get a good look at that big statue thing on the cliff. We popped the weather on the TV when we woke up and learned that the north coast of Devon and Cornwall were currently at a yellow weather alert because of Storm Noah, bringing gale force winds and heavy rain for the region.
Don't go near the coast. Obviously, there's going to be some very dangerous conditions.
Because of this, Tintagel was closed for the day, so we decided just to get on the motorways and head home sharpish. Frey picked out the town of Launceston to grab breakfast and to fuel up the bikes before heading home. Turns out Launceston has quite a bit to see and do, and the Red Chair Cafe next to the old city gate provided a very satisfying Cornish breakfast, and the nearby car park on Race Hill has free motorcycle bays. While eating breakfast, we watched the weather change between bright sunshine and heavy downpours and braced ourselves for the worst. We filled up the bikes at Tesco and rejoined the A30. The rain was just as bad as the previous day, though there was more traffic on the roads. We had both worn glove liners to try and help with the cold, but I feel like they just made our fingers wetter and amplified the wind chill. Just before the A30 meets the M5, a huge gust of wind knocked my magnetic tank bag off and into the road. Luckily there was a lay-by approaching, so we parked up and I headed back up the road on foot to find it. I didn't realise I was already recording at this point, so I thought I'd turn my camera on to capture my little trek when I'd actually just done the opposite. The bag had found its way across the barrier, but luckily not into a lane. Crossing a dual carriageway in heavy rain is one of the more terrifying things I've done, but I guess wearing high-vis, armour and a helmet is probably the safest way of doing something so dangerous. Luckily, the contents of the bag remained safely inside it, so we stashed it in Frey's back box before carrying on up north. The weather stayed miserable for some time, though before we reached Taunton services for a bit of a break, it was starting to improve. That didn't last long though, and before we reached Bristol, the weather was back in full force. We decided to stop at Gloucester services for some coffee and a final fuel stop, and before we made it there, we experienced a short but very heavy burst of hail, which turns out hurts like a bastard at 50 miles an hour, and was so heavy that most of the cars slowed down drastically for it. Stopping at Gloucester, we felt worse than while we were out on the road. We couldn't stop shivering and had no appetite. We fueled up on coffee and fuel for the bikes, and then headed back out again for the final run. Luckily, the weather did start improving from here, and the sun even came out for a little bit. While we could make it back home without filling up again, that would make for a long ride, so we decided to stop at Hopwood services on the M42 for a quick break, leaving us with around a 45-minute ride from there to home. We made it home feeling very soggy and very cold and very tired, and it took 3 days before my phone was convinced that there was no longer any moisture in the USB slot. What we had planned to be a nice ride out along coastal roads and fish and chips turned into an endurance event that left us both worrying about the possibility of discovering trench hand and having our luggage launched across a dual carriageway. I'm sure Padstow is lovely when the rain isn't coming in sideways, and I'm sure Tintagel is a wonderful sight to explore. Hopefully on my third attempt to visit I can actually get in there. Which leaves us looking forward to May's visit to Brighton Pier, which, with all the bank holidays that month, may make booking a hotel troublesome. If you've made it this far, please do consider subscribing to make sure you catch the next video, and do leave a like if you'd enjoyed someone bemoaning the very English weather for an entire video. See you next time.